So we're preparing this, we stream live just as I'm typing in. So I'm realizing that when I do the prep and I'm putting in, all the things in the, the forms that Facebook has, that we're live and you see that. And then when we record it, uh, that's what you get. And so there's a little bit of a, what is it? I mean, there's a little bit of a, the detritus at the top, but it's going on live. And because we don't edit, we just, hey, here it is. We're here. Then that's what you see. And so I tell people the way to do the pop-ups, these virtual pop-ups, come on live on Facebook Live at 11:45. We're on, and sometimes I'm a little early today. It's 11:38. I'm like a full 6 minutes ahead, but that's only because I like the time with you. I like the time with you, and we're live. You get to see behind the scenes. You get to see Emil's gongs. Was there a gong drop for New Year's? Did I miss a gong? No, we did. Maybe we'll do a gong drop next year. But once again, we're here because the museum is officially closed. And if you've been watching the news, I know that a lot of people have said, look, my New Year's resolution, I'm not going to watch the news. I'm not going to pay attention to what's going on, because when I pay attention to the news, it makes me feel bad. Okay, so I get it. I understand that. But you got to know what's going on in your community, right? Whether it's Stockton, San Francisco, LA, the region known as the San Joaquin Valley in COVID terms in California, where there are 0 ICU beds, zero ICU beds. So you think we're going to be open anytime soon? Maybe, if only to be an auxiliary for ICU beds will be open, but not for people to come see the museum, I don't think. So here we are. I'm Emil Guillermo, the museum director. The way to do these things, like I tell people, is just come on live on Facebook Live. And if you want to be on the Zoom with me, contact me before at filipinomuseum@gmail.com, filipinomuseum@gmail.com. Contact me and we'll do a Zoom together as a Facebook Live. Or you can go into the chat and you can, put your comments in chat, and I'll get to them later. Maybe not simultaneously, because sometimes the setup is kind of, you just never know with technology, right? Whether or not you can really do the things that you want to do, simultaneously. Oh, I've got such a tentative connection here, I might blow up. So, but you could do that. You could just sit back and chat. A lot of people just want to sit back and chat and just say, yeah, I like that, I don't like that. But as one of our past guests, because you can be a guest, Juanita Salai Wilson, she was just a chat member. I said, hey, tell me your story. And she sent me some pictures of her mother and father, and it was a story that resonated with a lot of our viewers, a lot of our listeners, because it was about a Filipino, an American national who came to America in 1929, I believe. And he lived a bachelor life in California until he met the love of his life. And she lived in Santa Maria, California, Central California, and they couldn't get married. She was white, he was Filipino, and they decided to go up to Washington to get married. That's the Filipino-American story. It's my story. My father's story came in 1928. My story. I'm sure there's parts of that story in your story. And if that's your story, come on and tell it to us. I like to say that the museum is where you are. And under these circumstances, let's tell each other stories. They're important stories. You say, hey, Emil, my story is not the stuff of museums. Yes, it is. well, Emil, this is not an incredible story. It's a common story. No, it's not. It's our story. It's a story that we tell. And we're going to do it here at the FANHS Museum with you. So communicate with me, email me. You can, I've got a number of email addresses. FilipinoMuseum@gmail.com. Amok Guy, AMOKGUY @gmail.com. Or my own personal email, EMILAMOK, EmilAmok@gmail.com. Get in touch with me. Say, hey, I want to be on your Zoom. I want to tell my story. Please do. Please do. So we do this. And like I said, the way to do this program that we do, come on live, watch it, chat with us. If you don't come in live, catch the recording. It'll be on a recording on our FANHS Museum page, FANHS Museum, @FANHS Museum on Facebook, right? Click on the live button, and then you'll see the tapes, the videos come up. We've done a number of them. Yesterday, we did one with Dan Gonzalez. It was about an hour and a half or so, one of our shorter ones. And you could just take your finger on the video and you can move it along, fast forward. Or you can just play it on your phone or on your computer. And it's like getting a little taste of Filipino-American history. Like you can watch it as a video program, or you can just listen to it like you're listening to, I don't know, who do you like to listen to on the radio these days? Not Rush Limbaugh. I think he did his last show of the year, or maybe the last show for a while. But I used to be on talk radio, but I don't know anyone on talk radio who I'd want to listen to regularly. But I'd come, if I were Filipino American, I'd listen to hear what was going on here at the FANHS Museum, the virtual pop-up. And, you could look at me and say, I wonder how his gongs are hanging. Or you could say, I'll just listen to it. And a lot of people come up to me and say, yeah, I just put it on my phone, click on it, play it, and I wash the dishes, I go for a run, I do whatever. Modern technology, right? And indeed, we're telling Filipino-American stories. We're telling Filipino-American stories that no one really knows. Now, if you heard my discussion yesterday with Professor Dan Gonzalez, he's Professor Emeritus at San Francisco State at the College of Ethnic Studies, Asian American, Filipino American Studies, but he still teaches one class a year. I think he's teaching one in the spring. And if you heard that, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about the stuff of today, because today is the stuff that's going on this coming week is important. Don't think that you're not a part of it. You are a part of it. Our broader coalition of Asian Americans, Filipino Americans, are part of that. And the certification of the November election is taking place this week. But there are a number of Republicans who say they're going to join in the call of fraud. They're going to join in with Donald Trump and challenge the certification of the vote. Is that fair? If you're a Filipino American and you voted for Trump, I guess maybe you'd say that's good. But if you're Filipino American and you voted for Joe Biden, as I think about 60% of you did, wouldn't you be upset that some people are trying to nullify your vote? That's why this week's important. And that's why when you look at the Republican senators who say they're going to join Ted Cruz and Donald Trump, to challenge the election, it's going to concern you a little bit. They're saying, hey, you voted in Stockton, you voted in wherever, LA, Washington State, Virginia, we're just going to nullify your vote. We're taking your vote away. We're going to decertify the election. How about that? How does that make you feel? Now, if you voted for Joe Biden, it should have upset you. If you voted for Donald Trump, hey, let's keep fighting. Hey, just like Manny Pacquiao, keep fighting. But maybe when you see the futility of it all, maybe it's wiser just to say, look, the best man won. The worst president in our history lost. Let's accept the results and move on. We've got a huge thing that we're dealing with now. The vaccine on top of the virus. People are dying. People aren't getting the vaccine. We've got some issues we got to deal with as a country. And Filipino Americans are part of this story. We're on the front lines. We're getting the vaccine first in the case of people who are fighting the virus, you know, the nurses, the hospital administrators, frontline workers. Got to do, I mean, we're in it, right? And also, I haven't seen the numbers in terms of who gets what kind of treatment and if we're getting unfair treatment, but they've done studies in New York that show that Asian Americans are not getting the kind of treatment they deserve or getting unequal treatment. And we know that broadly, when it comes to people of color, this has been it has not been equitable in terms of how people of color have been treated. We know that specifically South Asians, Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders. So the inequality has been exposed. The inequality of our society has been exposed through how we've dealt with COVID. You know, we got issues. And it's time for leadership on the federal level to say, hey, look, have you heard our discussion with Daniel Phil Gonzalez yesterday? I mean, you may be for small government, but at some point you've got to say public health is public health. All of us count, and we're fighting this together. I mean, this really is the COVID-19 war, and we're losing it. We are not winning. And maybe it's good that all this coincides with, you know, the anniversary dates of World War II, right? We had Pearl Harbor, December 7th, right? The Pearl Harbor attack. And maybe it's good that we thought when this happened a year ago, oh, this will be over by the summer when it gets hot, right? Oh, not over by the summer. Oh, it'll be over by the fall. Not over by the fall. Oh, you know, and so forth and so on. Well, watch out, it's going to get cold. And yes, we're seeing the spikes because the holidays have come up and we have not paid attention to this COVID war. But it's coincided with these key anniversary dates of World War II, the start of World War II, right? The surprise attack, Pearl Harbor. And for Filipino Americans or Filipino Americans, this is part of our history. 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese went into the Philippines. In fact, on January 2nd, that's when Manila fell. January 2nd, this weekend, right? An anniversary date. We should be paying attention to that because it's not just Filipino history there. It's also how it affected Filipinos who were in America at that time in the 40s, in 1941. The Filipinos in America who said, I'm going to join the 1st and 2nd Infantry. I'm going to go fight. I'm going to prove. That's our ancestral home, right? World War II, as I talked about it with Dan Gonzalez yesterday, it really is, you know, we talk a lot at the museum about the guys in the 20s and the 30s. That's an important time. We talk about the cicadas came in 1906, important time. We talk about 1898. We talk about the revolution, right? And we talk about the establishment of a Filipino government and then the Philippine-American War, and then American colonization, 1898. We talk about that. All that important, but 1941, not too long ago, that's important. Because as Dawn Mabalon in her book points out, World War II, watershed event for Filipino Americans. We had to decide, yeah, I'm going to go fight that war. I'm going to go to the Philippines. I'm going to sign up. We're going to go fight that war. And Filipinos who were in the Philippines were saying, FDR is saying, if I fight in the Philippines, I can be an American. And people like Ernie Mabalon, Don's dad, was there in Leyte, Samar, saying, I'm going to join. I'm going to be a guerrilla. And he was young enough, so he was a guerrilla as a teenager. Ernie Mabalon, yeah. Stockton's own. Young enough to be a guerrilla, fighting in the hills. Young enough then later to join not just the USA FFE, the U.S. Armed Forces and the foreign, right? That group. He was also a member of the regular U.S. Army. So, double honored Ernie Mabalon. Guerrilla, Scout, USA FFE, plus regular Army. That's our Filipino-American history. Came here to Stockton. You could read it all in Don's book, Little Manila's in the Heart. That's kind of like our Bible. We talk about it all the time because the goods are there. The history's there. It's important history. Who's teaching it? Who knows it? Well, we've kind of cracked open the door here at the museum, and you can get this history. We're telling you where to get it. We're telling you the way to the truth. But you know what really is special is when you hear what I'm saying here and you say, hey, my dad was part of the first and second. My dad went from Stockton to the Philippines. I mean, he joined the army to fight, to prove how loyal, how dedicated, how patriotic Filipino Americans were. Because it was not easy being a Filipino American in the 40s. You were seen as a second-class citizen. You were brought on to America in the 20s and 30s as a national, as an American national. Oh, look at the people we conquered, the Americans would say. They look just like us. They paraded us at the World's Fair in 1904, and everything looked good until 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act. And then they said, hey, you nationals, American, we want you to be aliens again. You're aliens. And you go home. You can self-deport. Not many did, because it was, as we've talked about in the past, it was not a good thing to self-deport. There's a lot of pride involved. You didn't want to go back to the Philippines if you had nothing to show. For some cases they borrowed money to take that steamboat to get to America. And now you're here in America, a bachelor, no women, no family. You're going to go back. Some stuck it out. They were young enough. And in the 40s, they got their chance at redemption, which was join the Army, join the Navy, be in there, fight to prove you are a patriotic American. It's important. Isn't that funny how that works? You know, we proved how patriotic, we were by going to war. Think about that. Think about what, we believed in the Constitution. We believed in America. We believed in the opportunity of America. We would put our lives on the line. That's patriotism. Filipino American patriotism. And what are we seeing today? You know, we're seeing 11 senators who are going to challenge the elections, putting one man over the Constitution, one man over our country, one man above it all to say, hey, it's important for him to be president and to prove something that cannot be proven, that there was some kind of fraud in the election. There was no fraud in the election. But, you know, we have 11 Republican senators who are willing to say, hey, let's audit that election for 10 days. Let's challenge the vote. There was fraud. We think it's a fraud that they're committing by saying there's a fraud. True patriots can see through that ruse. You want to see true patriotism? Go back to the 40s and see how Filipino Americans responded to what was going on in World War II. That's true patriotism. People today can take a lesson from that action. Because what we're going to see this next week on the part of the Republicans challenging the election, threatening the election, threatening the stability of our democracy, that is not true patriotism. But what happened in 1941 when Filipino Americans here answered that call to go back, true patriotism, Filipino American history. So that is important, and it's fundamental, right? Filipinos went from being, you know, aliens, substandard, demonized. When they answered that call, they were allies because, remember, the Japanese attacked right after Pearl Harbor. They attacked the Philippines. The Filipinos, they had some things to prove. Not only were they patriotic to America, they're also patriotic to their own ancestral home. Kind of double-edged, right? But the guys here knew. They knew what was at stake. The guys who signed up for the Army, the guys who signed up for the Navy, and went to war. Now, I said I was going to talk about the War Brides, and it's important because the War Brides Act was passed. They had an anniversary date. The War Brides Act of 1945, and it was passed December 28th, 1945. And remember what that meant, what that did. It said that if you were in the Philippines or you were in these areas, I mean, it didn't just apply to the war brides in the Philippines, but in any part, right, of the multiple theater war, World War II. If you had a family, if you created a family, had children, had a spouse during that time, during the war, you were able to bring them over. You granted admission of alien spouses and alien minor children of citizen members of the United States Armed Forces. That was it. And it brought over a ton of so-called war brides. That was the ticket. You recall 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act. I just mentioned it a few minutes ago. It essentially made Filipino immigration or immigration from the Philippines to the U.S. like a dozen people. I mean, it was really a fraction of what it was when we were nationals. It wasn't until 1965 that the Immigration Act opened it up, said those quotas that were placed on Filipinos were discriminatory, and they loosened up the number. But the real bump between 34 and 65 was the 1945 War Brides Act. They allowed these aliens to come in. You know, my mom was not a war bride. My father was not in the war. I tell this story in my one man show. He was not. He didn't qualify. He was for that really determines your life if were not in the military, because the military was the path to the middle class in America. It was also an easy path to a Filipino American family that you could start in America, or that started in the Philippines and was brought to America because of the War Brides Act. So my father was lucky. My mother came over as an alien. Somehow she was able to come as a valet to a rich Spanish patron. She met my dad, rest is history, right? That's a double gonger. And I just, it's just, this is the way, this is Filipino American history. This is how it happened. We all have stories. I want to hear yours. Email me. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about your mother, your father, how they came. Because as I was talking to Dan Gonzalez yesterday, it was not always seen as a nice. Is it nice? I mean, nice isn't the word, but it was not considered necessarily some high-minded thing that, oh, you're a war bride. In fact, it was almost like a kind of a put down, an insult in a way. Some people would rather not talk about it because sometimes it was lust and sometimes before love, as Dan pointed out, or sometimes it was not because there was it was maybe slightly arranged. Maybe there was a little wink, 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 wink. It was not considered as proper as I court you. We go through this long courtship, have this big Catholic wedding. The villages are brought together. The families are brought together. You have my caribou. I have 3 cocks, maybe a dozen. It's just, if you're a war bride, it had a stigma. And the stigma was to be avoided. Every stigma is not a good thing. Well, it could be a good thing if you overcome it and understand what's really going on. So I understand when I talk to a war bride, a son or daughter of a war bride, a lot of them didn't even know. They said, my mom didn't talk about it. My dad didn't talk about it. Well, my mom and dad, they split up, or they didn't have a happy marriage, or he was always at sea, or he was always whatever. There's always a story, because it was not seen as there was it was a war bride. They were a war bride situation, and was a stigma. They didn't talk about it. So, when things don't get talked about, they don't get written up as history, right? People don't want to talk about the history. There's still a lot of confusion, because even official researchers go back and they try to find the numbers. Well, the INS in the old days, the now defunct INS, did not distinguish between you were brought over because you were married to a GI, or you were brought over because you were just brought over by a Filipino American who went back to the Philippines to get a bride to bring back. Because just imagine the situation in the 40s. Young Filipino men who've been here in America since the 20s and 30s. The ratio was 14-1 male to female, right? You're talking about 30, 40,000 Filipinos in America, and 7% of that 40,000 were women. On top of that, the anti-intermarriage laws, and your chances of being married and starting a family, unless you were able to marry races, ethnicities that allowed you to, at least in California, it's tough. So you had Mexicans and Filipinos, you had blacks and Filipinos, whites and Filipinos, only if you went to a state that allowed it, right? So for many of these Filipinos who signed up for World War II to go back to World War II, man, it was the first time they saw a young Filipina. A young Filipina who was not related to them, a young Filipina who was a possible match, a young Filipina who they could marry. Imagine that. And the INS did not distinguish between they were GIs or they were Filipinos who went back. And so we don't really have a true war bride number, but the number that is often used by researchers is there were 56,000 Filipino war brides. There's a more precise number. I could read it for you that people come up with. What is the number? The number is 51,747 is the official number. Now, if you were 48, I'm sorry to leave you out. That's why I like to say in general, like, between 51, 55,000 out of 300,000 war brides. But, if you're a war bride or a descendant of a war bride, and I know some who are, they've done some research, they say 51,747. Do you know there was that many war brides? And how many of those were really proud of the fact that that was their circumstance? Some were, some weren't. Circumstance, right? Those are the stories. Those are the stories that are worth talking about, that are worth saying, hey, this is why the war bride story is one of those areas of Filipino American history that is ripe for research, ripe for discussion, ripe for just to get this sense of where we are. I mean, look, I go back and forth on this. I have been wrong about this in the past. When I see Filipino women's groups, I know it's important to have women's groups. I know if you're a double minority, it's even worse. And, maybe males, Filipino males, have a slight step up. I'm much more egalitarian. I think we all get screwed, Filipino men and Filipino women. But it's a sexist as well as racist world. And I know that Filipino women sometimes do not get the breaks they deserve. But this is one of those ironies where, because of this war bride situation, you heard Dan Gonzalez talk about that yesterday. You had Filipino men who were they were the military guys, brought their wives over in America. They were the breadwinners. They got the jobs, and the Filipino women were the family, the homemakers, right? But they were more than that, because we know that it took a lot more effort to keep the household together, to keep the kids and the schools. And God, those of you who are involved in homeschooling or with Zoom schooling, it's not easy. And the Filipino women then also were part of those auxiliary groups of the Filipino organizations. And they were the power forces. They were the doers, right? Because they knew they were connected in the community, families. And I mentioned one cousin of mine, one aunt of mine. She was my Auntie Lori. She was the spine that held things together in the Laogueño community in San Francisco for the longest time. So it's I know how important it is to celebrate women, to give women their say, to give them their groups, their power groups, because they have not often um, they've been denied in a lot of ways. I mean, like I said, there's these ironies, these individual ironies where you have strong the matriarchal element comes through, but the War Brides Act is one story. I know there are scholars out there who are working on this area and have, but it's an eye opener when you talk to descendants of war bride families, and some don't know the history because it wasn't talked about, because it was seen as somehow not quite as proper. And we want to change that. We want to change that feeling now. We want to like get the information out and let people know there's nothing wrong with being a descendant of a war bride. In fact, many of them, as I point out, were they were matriarchs in their own communities, wherever they were. Um, I know that on the FANHS Museum board, one of our trustees, Erwin Mina, talks about his mom. His mom died last year, 2020, of COVID. And, or actually, I believe it was just under, because she died during COVID, but it was still the same, where she, you know, you could not be with her in the last moments. You can't hug and embrace. But she was important to a lot of Filipinos who came through the Central Valley, who came through Delano. She supported men and women who came through with food and with jobs. She helped them navigate America in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So the women of our community, the War Bride story is just one portion of their great story. And if you go to the museum, you'll see the wall dedicated to Filipino American women, and you'll see the military people who answered the call of FDR, who were intelligence agents. You'll see uh, my my good friend Thelma Buckholt, who was the first Filipino American female legislator there at the state of Alaska. You'll see other women, and I'm sure we'll. I think we have a post of that wall in either our Facebook page or on our website, but we'll get that. We'll get that soon. And so the war brides. It's an important moment in between the 30s and the 60s. It's a wave of immigration that we rarely acknowledge, and we acknowledge that today. Now, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to go to just a little reading from Dawn Mabalon's book, because I think it's important. Let's see. Let's see here. Okay, share my screen. And there I am there. So here, war brides and family reunification. The new naturalization laws resulting population explosion after the war made the community grow in leaps and bounds, writes Dawn Mabalon. Though the Loose Cellar Act only allowed 100 immigrants to enter per year, The dramatic increase came from immigrants arriving as a result of family reunification, the immigration of war brides, and Filipino enlistees in the U.S. Navy and Army. So that Loose Seller Act, that 100 immigrants to enter per year, that was the law until 1965. But because of the war, right, we have family reunification, the immigration of war brides, Filipino enlistees in the U.S. Navy and Army. With citizenship, those who had enlisted could now bring over their immediate family members. A provision of the 1924 Immigration Act allowed citizens to welcome their immediate relatives, spouses, parents, and children as non-quota immigrants. Those quotas began 1924, right? The real quotas, and then more in 1934, they banned immigration. Citizens began the process by filing a petition to the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, that's what it was called then, for an alien relative to obtain an immigrant visa. Now that Filipinos could become citizens, they could petition their parents, spouses, and children and reunify their families. Moreover, citizenship and new legislation, such as the War Brides Act, passed in 1945, allowed many Filipinos to finally marry and start families. After 1947, the Military Bases Agreement between the Philippines and the United States allowed the military to recruit up to 2,000 Filipinos a year. The majority were U.S. Navy seamen, many of whom were out of Cavite. Also, among these post-war arrivals were college students who were allowed to study for graduate degrees in the U.S. as a result of the U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948. So here Dawn shows her grandmother, Isabel Torona Mabalon, her grandfather, Pablo Magdaleno Mabalon. They pose on Lafayette Street to commemorate the reunion in 1947. Dawn writes, my father, Ernesto, who we talked about earlier in the pod, in this pop-up, carried this photo in his wallet for much of his life. On the back, he had written, mother and father reunited after 17 years apart. Isn't that funny? You carry around stuff in your wallet. This is why, I remember going to the ER where my dad, when he died, and as I went through his things just to collect his things before his body went to the morgue, that he had this wallet and he had pictures of me, my sister, all my siblings, the sons and daughters of the siblings. And I know it wasn't just me, because here's Dawn and her dad, or Dawn showing her dad what was in her dad's wallet, a shot of Ernie's father and mother reunited. So between 1946 and 1960, approximately 21,912 Filipinos immigrated to the U.S., and Stockton was one of the main West Coast cities where they chose to live, along with Seattle, Salinas, Vallejo, San Diego, San Francisco, and L.A. Census numbers tell the story of Filipina immigration and Filipino-American family formation in the post-war years. In 1940, only 1,502 Filipinas were known to be living in the United States. That's in 1940. In 1950, the census counted 51,041 Filipinas. In 1940, the census counted only 5,327 married Filipinos. In 1950, the number was 17,616. So look, almost more than 3 times in 10 years. And that's due to the war and to war brides. And Dawn tells the story of her family in her book, but this is also your story too. And whether you're in Stockton or in Salinas or wherever, it's it's a it's a story that's out there, and it's a story that we want to expose and share right here at the museum. Because as I say, the museum is where you are. So, a little something today about war brides, the impact of the war brides, the impact of World War II. And really, Dawn's book, which is kind of our guide, we're in Stockton. She was a beloved resident, native of Stockton, and she wrote the book, Little Manila's in the Heart. It's hard to get over the first couple of sections, right? I mean, those were the key sections, really, about immigration here, and we've gone over that from Hawaii to the 20s and the 30s and the violence toward Filipinos. But it's really World War II where things change. And we're going to revisit that because, we're in that period now, right? December had Pearl Harbor, then they attacked the Philippines, then they allowed the Filipinos to be drafted, and they joined, or some enlisted and joined the 1st and 2nd Infantry, and that's an important part of Filipino American, way more important than I think people give it credit. I think a lot of it just people forget. As veterans die, I think the veterans issue kind of, equity for the veterans kind of overtook some of the other historical overtones about what those veterans meant to the community. We were fighting for them, fighting for their equal pay, fighting for them to overcome the Rescission Act of 1946. And along the way, we forgot, hey, not only did they fight, but they really were the second layer after the 30s, the 20s and 30s guys, those Manongs, the veteranos were that next layer of our community. And in fact, we're really the start of a massive number of Filipino Americans, the baby boom, which, I'm a part of. You talk about the boomers, the Filipino American baby boom, same thing. I mean, this is our version of the baby boom because when the military folks came back in general, right? The Caucasian military folks came back. What happened when they came back from fighting? Came back to the home front. Boom, explosion, right? And it lasted a while. You hear about that. All those are the boomers that people relate to. But the Filipino baby boom, that was something. We're part of that. That's the growth and the explosion of the Filipino American middle class. And we'll continue to talk about that in our pop-ups. So we covered a lot of ground. If you missed any or all, or you came toward the end here, go to this will repeat on Facebook Live. It'll also be on YouTube. I'll also post a version on my amok.com website, amok.com, also known as whatthefleep.com. Yeah, What the Fleep. You can get it, What the Fleep. And also on kingofolympia.com. I got them all. King of Olympia? Really, Emil? Or Olympia King, olympiaking.com. Try it. But it's always fun doing these pop-ups. We're all volunteer here at the museum. And after I do this, hey, we got a board meeting this afternoon. What will we talk about? Filipino history going forward. Thank you again for joining these pop-ups. Probably popping up in this week because a lot's happening this week. Certainly back on Saturday and Sunday with you. We're here 11:45 or thereabouts Pacific time to about 12:15, 12:30 Pacific time. Sundays are Sunday brunch. Bring your own pancit. Saturday, we usually have someone to talk to, a guest, but we all do it because this is the museum for now when we can't open. You know, we're closed, but we're not. We're still talking about Filipino American history. We'll do it right here on the FANHS Museum Facebook page, on the FANHS Museum YouTube page, on my amok.com site. We'll talk about it. So with that, I shall say goodbye for now. I'd like to go on, but time does not permit me. So until then, as my good friend, check again. Hey, stay in touch with us on YouTube or on on the chat. As my dear late lamented friend would say, mahals and salamats.